Welcome to the Flip Your Script podcast. I'm Christy Peel. This podcast is all about sharing stories, and there are things we talk about openly today with strangers, even on social media, that were totally taboo just a few decades ago. We have today's guest to thank in part for how mainstream the topic of mental health is. Patrick J. Kennedy is the Kennedy Forum founder, former U.S. House of Representatives member, and New York Times bestselling author. Welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So the way that I set this all up is, mental health is one of the things that you have dedicated your career to. And when people have public lives, which you have had your entire life because you were born into a family that knows publicity, you can use that for a lot of different purposes. And you chose to go down this path of mental health and made some significant law changes. Why mental health? What is it about that for you?
Well, mental health is really the new frontier, both in brain research. We have an extraordinary opportunity to really understand the brain and come up with much better therapeutics if we're organized really with the supercomputing power that we have and with a more global approach. Because in order to understand the brain, we're going to need massive cohorts of people. Our own country's not enough. So we're going to have to partner with countries around the world to really do this. And it's a terrific global challenge because the challenges we face as a nation in terms of the impact on our economy of youth mental health, as well as, cognitive decline and Alzheimer's and so forth, it's so enormous. It's going to impact every area of our budgets. And it's not just us, it's the world. So there's a real opportunity to develop a universal agenda that can bring very disparate kind of advocacy groups together because it's in a combined interest, whether someone's interest is in the economic benefits or others are interested in the personal and humanistic benefits. The bottom line is we all benefit if we make this more a central part of our thinking as a nation, because it really is an issue that affects all aspects of our nation, from our defense. We just can't recruit enough people that can pass a drug test, to even office environments where similar issues, to our whole education system, which cannot be realized if we have kids who can't focus and concentrate because they're impeded by a mental illness that keeps them from living their fully self-actualized lives. So this is really the new frontier. President Kennedy, my uncle, talked about the new frontier of 1960, and while only part of it had to do with mental health, in fact, the last bill he signed was called the Community Mental Health Act, a lot of it was very aspirational, obviously going to the moon, the Peace Corps, nuclear test ban treaty. The beauty of all of that is it talked about an aspirational goal for this country. And as a nation, we need very aspirational goals to address this mental health crisis. We just are reacting to it in a very small ball way when it's taking so many of our fellow citizens' lives and frankly, ruining the life of so many Americans in terms of the quality of their life. So I think we really need to think much bigger because unfortunately, our current thinking about how many dollars to resource this challenge and build out infrastructure to treat these illnesses is so confined by our lack of vision as to what is possible if we were to really approach this in a new way.
It's so interesting. I never thought about it the way that you just said it, which, it's this big aspirational goal. And you compared it a little bit to your uncle and, man on the moon. And we now, history has shown that when, hey, we're going to put a man on the moon, that was a ridiculous thing to say. Like we didn't have the technology. We didn't have any of the planning, but it was this thing that galvanized the whole country and got a whole bunch of people really excited. And they realized, my goodness, we can do more than we think. But mental health is such a big topic. And you say mental health to 100 people, they're going to tell you it means 100 different things. So how do you galvanize people around a thing so that they can say, okay, success looks like X?
So I thought, Sputnik and the Cold War was what galvanized our race to the moon. It was a national security issue. We didn't want the Russians to beat us to the moon. Today, when you look at traumatic brain injury for our soldiers, they're suffering a great continue for the rest of their lives. All those who served our country in Iraq and Afghanistan. And if you also think about trauma, post-traumatic stress, we're seeing two of the signature wounds of war for our nation's military veterans. And in a sense, it's a national security issue because it really impacts our military readiness, and frankly, it impacts the health of our American heroes, and that affects our first responders similarly. So what we should be doing is investing, because this is a bipartisan issue, our veterans, in the research of traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress. If we were to do that, we accomplish the whole brain, every illness out there. Because if you think of all neurodegenerative disorders, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, even understanding autism and developmental disabilities, all could be within the purview of traumatic brain injury, because it's really traumatic brain injury which disrupts the brain function, which leads to all of those other kind of neurodegenerative disorders. On the trauma side, post-traumatic stress, if you research that, you would understand anxiety, you would understand depression, you would understand addiction. So in a very simple way, because I totally agree with you, there is this fragmentation of our advocacy that keeps us from thinking about these issues in a more holistic way. One example, my Aunt Rosemary suffered from an intellectual disability, faced an intellectual disability. Suffer is a different way of thinking at a different time. We celebrate people with intellectual disabilities thanks to Special Olympics, which my family, my Aunt Eunice founded. The idea that my Aunt Eunice got President Kennedy to research dementia back in 1961 and 2, and got him to sign this new institute called the National Institute for Children and Human Development. Their number one priority was researching dementia. Now you might say, well, why is the institute focusing on kids interested in dementia? It was because people with Down syndrome and other intellectual disabilities suffered from dementia at much higher rates. Alzheimer's really came on the scene in the last 20 years. Frankly, we advanced understanding of dementia, laid the foundation for Alzheimer's research, which obviously is for elderly, because we did it for people with Down syndrome. My point being, we never knew when we researched kids in that institute that we would be benefiting elderly. And the irony of all ironies, my Aunt Eunice, her husband, my Uncle Sarge, died of Alzheimer's. And all of her kids, my 5 Schreiber cousins, are all at a higher risk level and profile for dementia, all of which we have a better kind of track on because we researched Down syndrome, which my point is that when you research the brain, we're so fragmented, we don't appreciate the serendipitous findings of that research. So I've been asked to speak, Michael J. Fox, the Parkinson's Action Network. The biggest problem for people with Parkinson's is not just the neurodegenerative symptoms, it's the mood disorder aspects of Parkinson's that is so challenging to people who live with Parkinson's. Now, who would think about that? You usually think of Parkinson's and the tremors and the kind of neurological aspects. You don't think about the mood disorder. But my point is we have to start to think more holistically, because the brain is like the highway. We need to build the highway so that we can have the off-ramps for Parkinson's, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, other addictions. And we don't have the framework, the infrastructure to advance everything from Alzheimer's research. When you think about Alzheimer's patients, their psychiatric comorbidities are really a big problem because of their mood, because of their other kind of thinking distortions, which are all driven by the dementia. My point is that we so silo our thinking that we miss the opportunities to have a much bigger vision. So I think the definition of this is really key. So I'd say that on the neuroscience, but it's a good metaphor for the overall treatment. So treatment is all siloed too. So if you thought about everything from depression, anxiety, addiction, and people with schizophrenia and bipolar, what do we all need? We need community supports. We don't just need pills and a great therapist, because that's great, but it's still not getting people off the streets. We need to have community psychosocial supports. And if we did that, we could get together with AARP, which is the biggest advocacy group in Washington. Now you say to yourself, why do we care about what AARP is, but part of mental health? Well, if we got AARP involved, we'd address not only mental health and frankly addiction skyrocketing amongst our elderly, we could also get one of the most powerful advocacy groups in the world, our seniors, and get them to support kind of screening and early intervention for kids. And why is that? Because we know that anxiety and depression actually accelerate the pruning of cells that ultimately lead to much higher risk and earlier onset of Alzheimer's, believe it or not. So the point is that we all need to be in this together. We've so siloed. And then the other point is, if you're a Parkinson's person, a person with other physical needs, you need a community, home care, visiting nurses, a community organization where people can go during the day. All of that helps address social isolation, not only for people with intellectual and other physical disabilities and mental illnesses and addictions. It helps all of us to build that infrastructure of connectivity in the community. My point is that when we advocate for mental health and addiction, we are so small in our thinking. We don't partner with all of these powerful advocacy arms in regular, quote unquote, physical health care that can help drive our mental health addiction, because first of all, they don't think our issues are their issues, and we don't think their issues are our issues. But if we were ever able to build the story like you are talking about and tell that story effectively, we could advance a much bigger agenda for mental health and addiction, because everyone with heart disease would care about it, because you're 4 times more likely to die of a heart attack if you have depression. Everyone with diabetes would care about addiction, because if you're someone who has an alcohol use disorder, try to treat diabetes, on and on. But we don't have any of those other medical societies and advocacy groups understanding the criticality of them helping us in the mental health addiction world do a much better job at building infrastructure that will not only help us, but help them as well.
It's such a fascinating way to think about it. And I think there's 2 things that I want to kind of parse out. And I want to start with community, and then I want to get to story. But on the community side, when you start talking about mental health and neuroscience and brain health, I think a lot of people go, oh, well, I'm not a doctor. Well, that must be nice for researchers. And when you start talking about community and AARP, people, I think, go to like, well, I know someone who's an AARP, or I know someone who's a member, or I'm in a community, or boy, it's terrible that kids these days don't have community like we used to have. But when you start getting on a community level, like all of us have a role to play in helping people be part of communities and ensuring that we're active in some community groups. Is that kind of your message for the average person who doesn't have their own personal addiction story or their own, neuroscience degree? Is that the message?
So my message is we have to change the political power such that people with addiction and mental illness have a seat at the table. We still don't, because it's their fault that they're this way. And we don't want to talk about it. So basically, we have no advocates. We have a small amount, psychiatrists or people at NAMI, or people who have families lost a loved one to suicide or overdose. There's a very discrete group of advocates. But the bottom line is we all should be advocates, because all of our family members have alcoholism, addiction, depression, anxiety, period. Every single one of the people listening to this podcast has family. And they all, if they have, like me, children growing up, all have to be conscious that this is a problem that because we don't have the infrastructure to deal with, we're all going to be, even the people who are the most well-off and connected, are struggling to find the right care at the right time for their loved ones. So this is a existential challenge for the public health of our country. We're literally seeing Americans' lifetime expectancy go down at a time when biomedical research is at an all-time high in terms of its ability to change the trajectory of our life expectancy. It's all being dragged down because we've never focused our efforts on mental illness and addiction as major public health challenges. Now we're focusing on them, but still we have so much to catch up with: cancer and heart disease and these other. So when I'm talking about, I know it sounds to the layperson, well, what's he talking about? Hey, I'm talking because I grew up in a political family and I spent 16 years in Congress, 6 before that, and in the state legislature. I'm talking about political power, because if all of us understand the value of making these investments for all of us, now the question has to be, how are we going to get it done? And so my field of interest is, how do we change the political dynamic in order to facilitate all of us having a much more effective treatment and early intervention, frankly, system for the future, which will involve our family members in the future, which we should all care deeply about.
And you talked about kind of changing the narrative and sharing stories, which is exactly, what your book does. It's the stories of everyday people sharing their mental health stories and removing some of that shame, which I think is the distinctive between mental health struggles and cancer and heart disease and some of these other things. Rarely when someone gets cancer, do you think like, well, wonder what happened in their childhood, or wonder what they did, which is often where people go when they hear addiction or they hear some of these mental health challenges. Is there's this kind of blame and shame that keeps people from sharing their stories. And when people don't share their stories, then we can't normalize it and there's no one advocating. The book that came out in April, it's different people's stories about mental health. Is that what the goal of the book was? And is it accomplishing what you want it to accomplish?
So the goal of the book is to help all of us have a better understanding about the messiness of having these illnesses, because, post a number of celebrities now saying they have diagnoses, we really don't understand what it really entails. And I think that leads to a lot of people feeling very isolated because they think to themselves, well, I haven't gotten it together, or recovery hasn't worked for me, or therapy doesn't work, or medication is not properly adjusted. The bottom line is, this is a messy illness to treat. We don't have the A1C and then the insulin, and we don't have the specific radiation, chemo, surgery approaches like we do with cancer. So people back away because they think this is too complex. The fact is, it is complex, but that doesn't mean we can't tackle it. First, we have to understand what it is. And I don't think the current stories are really fully telling of what it's like to live with these illnesses. So in this book, Profiles in Mental Health Courage, I talk to not only the people with different diagnoses, I talk to their family, their parents, their siblings, their children, and their coworkers. A lot of what we don't understand about this is just the impact that it has on everyone around the person with the diagnosis. If we did that better, I think it would be easier for us, again, back to my original view, we'd be able to generate the political support to do something meaningful about addressing this problem. Because I'm not only a person in recovery from addiction, but I grew up in an alcoholic home, and it has wreaked havoc on my emotional and psychological development. And I'm trying to do my best to break that cycle so I don't pass it on to my kids, who, by the way, already have a genetic predisposition for addiction. in their genes. So, but my point is that I want people to understand real life stories so they have a comfort level. Now, if you are someone with one of these illnesses, I want you to be able to read your story in these 12 stories, because I think that they're very universal in a lot of the aha moments that people will have when they read each chapter, which represents a very broad diversity of both diagnoses and backgrounds.
So, in our current political environment, and we just had an election, and it was an election that no one really predicted that this is where we would be, and such domination. Do you have more or less confidence that your vision of success and moving this forward will happen?
Well, I've had a number of people who are in really well-placed positions on the Republican side, very helpful to us at the Kennedy Forum, because these are issues that know no partisan bounds. I'm active in my church, in my area. And because I had my first book, A Common Struggle, people in my neighborhood knew of my connection in the space. I get approached all the time in my church for help for fellow parishioners who need their loved one to get treatment, don't know or where to turn. So I just got back from seeing the Holy Father in Rome, and Cardinal Supich and Cardinal Tobin, who's also in recovery. And he's like very close to the Holy Father. What do they want? They want Catholic dioceses to have more resources for their parishioners, and they want the church to help facilitate that. So I'm taking the folks that I know and saying, hey, the church is interested in how do we support local clergy to support their parishioners. Now, by the way, a lot of the folks in these communities, by, if you would, partisan lines, may not share my political philosophy on a lot of issues. It doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, we're all in this together. When I'm on Fox News, because I'm their token Democrat, to talk about how wrong-headed our approach is in commercializing marijuana and these other addiction for-profit industries like sports betting, which is going to create havoc, particularly for young men on the gambling addiction side, which we know has the highest correlation to suicide of any diagnosis in the mental health space. Like, I think addiction for profit is a terrible thing for our public health, but the reality is states are commercializing marijuana all across the country. Now, I am for decriminalization of small amounts, because we don't want to incarcerate people with the disease of addiction, but we have to be very clear that this is not good for the public health. And so anyway, my point is, after ever I'm on, I get flooded with texts because I'm in recovery. And as I said, I have a lot of fellows in recovery with me. They all text me, which basically tells me they're all watching Fox News. It doesn't matter, because yes, we come from different philosophies, but we're all unified by the fact that this is affecting all of us as human beings and as families. Needless to say, we're in a different space. We have to be mindful that we have to build infrastructure. Now, our case might have to be made on, if you want to reduce red ink down the line to save, quote, entitlement programs, we've got to really understand the upstream costs of mental health, not because we necessarily care about all of those people living on the street, but that we care about the fact that they're exhausting a lot of precious public resources in jails and being stuck in ERs, and having our police and fire have to spend so much of their time transporting them back and forth and picking them up. Like, that makes no sense, humanistically. It doesn't make any sense financially. So there should be a way for us to marry both a fiscally conservative thought process and a very kind of progressively liberal thought process on the values piece, and marry it and say, here's something we can all fight for, because whatever our position, we all can see a common interest in the answer. So I'm convinced we're going to be able to find ways to work together. And I'm excited by that opportunity.
Such an interesting thing to think about with politicians, particularly who, we all, hopefully all of us went and voted. And I can't imagine many politicians are out there saying, you know what, I'm an addict. I have a significant depression. I mean, that isn't like a way to win, because people then think, are you okay to be in this position?
Right.
So it's this like dichotomy of, it's a really important thing that impacts all of us, but we kind of don't want to talk about it.
No, it's so true. It's so
us.
true. No, it's so true. So I remember when the parity bill, which I had authored in the Congress, was up for a vote, and I had already heard from a lot of my Republican colleagues about how their lives have been severely impacted by mental illness and addiction, including many of them suffering from addiction, as I have. But they voted no on the parity bill. And of course, all of their confidences are just that, confidential. But I would stop them afterwards, say, how could you vote against this? I've talked to you. It's so personal to you. And they said, Patrick, I don't come from the same part of the country you come from. I come from the buckle of the Bible Belt. And they still look at these issues as moral failings, not medical failings. And also, if I were to ever vote for it, then they try to find out why I was for it. And maybe they would find out that my daughter tried to take her life. And that would really, I think, force my daughter over the edge. I cannot afford to take that chance. So this is the calculus of a lot of my colleagues who may have a different political philosophy, but are very much in it. Like I just know I have tons of friends on both sides of the aisle, because this is, as I said, such a universal issue. But stigma is still so alive. And the reason I wrote this book, Profiles in Mental Health Courage, is because we need to have more transparency about the fact that these are universal conditions affecting all of us, irrespective of our political philosophies.
And the example that you gave about, politician and child, unlike other health situations, that it's very appropriate to say my daughter has whatever, fill in the blank. You feel like, okay, if it's a mental health or an addiction, it's sort of theirs to share. So the parent can't, be out there publicly if the kid doesn't want to talk about it. That's right. It adds this other kind of layer that makes it even more difficult to talk about, because you sort of feel like you need their permission to talk about it, and not everyone wants their parents talking about whatever. So how do you encourage people in those situations? So
in my book, Profiles in Mental Health Courage, I talked to my cousin who lost his 23-year-old to suicide. And he talked to me first time in 7 years since his son, Harry, took his life, because he didn't want to talk. He couldn't talk about it, right? Which you can understand. But he also got me to talk to Harry's brother, Belton, and Harry's roommate in college. When I talked to all three of them, none of them knew what I was talking to the others about. And then I put it in one chapter. They were all surprised to hear what the others said. So Mark didn't know what Harry's brother saw and felt and observed. And Mark didn't know what Harry's roommate in college saw, felt, observed. And neither one of them understood what Belton saw or what Mark even understood as the father. If they had had a conversation, because it wasn't stigmatized and they cared to the ends of the earth about Harry, they all loved him deeply, and felt like this is not something like some personal judgment we're making on him. He's just got an illness and we better talk about it because we want to make sure he gets better like we would any other illness. You might have been able to get a response to Harry's crisis that would have preempted his ultimately deciding to take his life, because the illness was speaking to him in a distorted way, which is the characteristic of these illnesses. So that would be one reason why we've got to break stigma, is we want to save lives. And unfortunately, suicide is so high and continues to climb, as does addiction. So if we're not much more on it, like, I don't want my kids, everything these days, we got to get much more upstream and having discussions. But the other piece is under law, parents aren't allowed to know what's going on with their kids after 18. That has to be looked at, because the honest to God truth is most of the serious mental illnesses, and frankly, even addictions, manifest after they're, quote, of the age of consent, where they're adults. And it means that their parents, who love them unconditionally, care about them more than anyone else would out there, can do nothing to save their family member's life. We have to figure out a way to have, and frankly, there are ways. It's just that we haven't educated our medical personnel as to what are the appropriate ways to talk about it, where you're not keeping your loved one secrets secret when it's going to, lead to their premature death and suffering. So that would be a violation of first do no harm, right? So yes, we want to protect confidentiality, but there ought to be ways where we could include the family in the support and care of their loved ones' recovery. Frankly, we separate the family from the loved one's recovery, which is entirely the wrong approach. So if you have addiction, the whole family is impacted. You need to include the whole family in recovery to the extent whatever is possible. And same with these other approaches. We have to have a much more comprehensive. So what I'm saying is this requires a new thinking and policy, which in my book, again, Profiles of Mental Health Courage, at the end of it, I have a QR codes, because everyone who participated in this book wanted to be part of changing the system. So I figured if you're reading this book and you find out, look at all of these obstacles to people getting care, how do I begin to fix that? I wanted to give them an agenda. And we need that agenda, because today we have agendas, whether it's a labor union agenda, chamber of commerce agenda, environmental agenda. We don't have an agenda on the issue that's affecting every family, which is, how do we address this crisis of mental illness and addiction?
It's so important. I mean, it certainly has impacted my family, and you see different people turn towards and help, and let's have a conversation about an illness, and then other people who say, "Oh boy, if I acknowledge this or if I have conversations about it, perhaps I have to think that I played a role in it." And again, back to the shame and back to all of these things. So books like yours, so important, and conversations like this are so important, so that we can even, go to coffee with someone and say, "Hey, I have an addict in my family." Okay, wow, me too. Like, let's just share our experiences. We're not going to judge the person or go back to what we contribute to it. That is not helpful. But let's talk about our experience and the impact and how we can be shared, back to the shared experience. If the three people would have had the conversation, gosh, would have been certainly a different chapter in that story, with your relative. So when it comes to what we all can do, it certainly feels like having conversations and sharing stories is part of what your book advocates for.
Well, the right way. See, the big thing is we have a very prurient, salacious, scandalous way of talking about these illnesses. So when people read this book, they'll, I think, appreciate the way it was written. I partnered with a brilliant journalist named Stephen Fried, professor of journalism at Columbia School of Journalism. And he's brilliant. So I picked the best, because I want to make sure that these narratives are told in a way that has been uncharacteristic of the way that narratives have been expressed in the past, and which I think will be the way that we can break through the kind of shaming way that we currently talk about these illnesses as I said, character flaws as opposed to chemistry issues. There is a moral requirement for those of us who are in recovery to stay in recovery, because our illnesses are so impact everyone around us. We have an obligation far beyond above our trying to for own self-preservation. But when someone's in the middle of one of these illnesses, they have lost the power to decide. It's the characteristic of these illnesses that, one, someone doesn't have the insight to know they have the illness. And two, they're so kind of consumed by it, they don't think about anyone else but themselves. So we have to understand the distinction that those of us who are able to get on the other side in recovery have an obligation to stay there, have a moral responsibility because of the implications of our not staying in recovery on everyone around us. So we're not about giving people a pass, right? We just have to make sure we understand where agency begins. And agency does not begin when someone is, pathologically ill from, psychosis and from addiction. So in any event, I'm hoping the book kind of advances understanding, and thrilled that you've given me an opportunity to talk about it on your podcast, and certainly look forward to having a chance to, get help from people that are listening to this for the whole idea of building a new kind of movement. I think we will see it in the years ahead, and we'll see it a lot sooner than not if people who are listening to this, get engaged. And by the way, it's business people making sure that their work environment is supportive of those with these illnesses. The best retention you can have for a workforce is if you make, for example, those in recovery a part of your employment and support them, because now they'll be so grateful. I've seen it to those that are, accepting and supporting of them. And we need to, ensure that we also support our kids to learn about how to self-modulate, which is basically how to manage their intrusive thoughts and their counterproductive thinking and their self-defeating self-talk. Because if we are able to help our kids earlier with problem solving and coping mechanism development, they're going to be more, self-actualized. They're going to live much more productive, fulfilling lives. And we need to get everybody on board with this idea that we need to get in much earlier than we currently are in terms of these major public health challenges have to focus on our kids. And that means we have to change up how we approach bringing services into public schools. And we can't take this idea that this is like some cabal of liberal, folks trying to impose. Listen, every kid needs this. And by the way, the Green Berets and the special forces already do this for our special operators, because they can't effectively accomplish a mission if their minds are cluttered with intrusive thoughts. So they actually teach our strongest military operators how to do these coping mechanism and self-modulation techniques. If it's good enough for the Green Berets, it should be good enough for our kids to start learning about their brains and knowing how they can mediate all the stresses that, frankly, every kid is facing, all of us are facing in this increasingly toxic world that we're living in.
Yeah, there are very few things that we can say, boy, the Green Berets can do it, and so can I, right?
Well, we all can do it, to various levels, but
Yeah.
the concept is it's in the interest of the business community, our economy, the military, to do better self-management, skill development, and resiliency training, and all of that. Let's start earlier. Let's start where our kids can really make use of this during a time in their lives where, unfortunately, so many of our kids are falling off because they don't have that skill development in place for them when they're young.
That's a great point. We've covered kind of all the generations and all the different ways that we can, step in and hopefully make the path a little bit easier and better and more healthy for the next generation and those who are the oldest in our society as well. Thank you for sharing your story. We end every podcast by asking the same question. Is there a quote, mantra, song, lyric, something that you would share with us that has helped you really through your path and through your journey with this topic?
Yeah, well, a couple. I mean, my Uncle Bobby said, each one of us can work to change just a small portion of events. And in the totality of all those acts will be written the history of our generation. what he was saying is one of us can make a difference. It's not up to all of us to figure out, well, I'm not going to try until the world supports my perspective on how things ought to be. All we can be responsible for is our own actions. And so that quote from Robert Kennedy really appeals to me. And of course, Dr. King, you said, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We have to try to think of each other as brothers and sisters in this world. We're all children of God, and we cannot allow the degradation of anyone's dignity, because that is a degradation on us as divine beings. And so I'm just so grateful to you, Christy, for having me on, and thank you for helping to spread the word about the importance of these issues.
It's really important stuff. Thank you for all the work that you're doing, and look forward to seeing, things change and things continue to improve. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Christy.
Well, I want to mention the name of the book again, Profiles in Mental Health Courage by Patrick J. Kennedy. I encourage you to get it and to read these stories. And if you have someone in addiction and you're really struggling, there are so many different groups that can help. We're going to put some of the phone numbers on the website so you can have an easy access if you need help right now. And I think the challenge, the Flip Your Script Weekly Challenge, is really to just think differently about, a character flaw or a chemistry. And if we can start thinking that way and sharing stories, and if there's something in your family that's happened or around you and you're not ready to share it publicly and you don't want to go to coffee with someone and talk about it, get a journal, write it down. The more that we can think about these people and as Patrick said, as divine, wonderful creatures who deserve help and deserve, better futures. And if we got to start with our own mind and journaling through that, that's a great place to start. My hope is Patrick's story empowers you to believe you're capable of more than you think, to discover motivation, to uncover inspiration, and to find the strength to turn the page.